I don't know if you want to tell me about your morning at CTV or something, just so I can look at the level.
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, the morning at CTV went really well. I mean, the fellow there, Chris, really caught the everything that's in a 4-minute kernel as to what the book was about, and so I didn't have to sort of stress to compress the way sometimes you have to.
Stress to compress.
Well, you know, when you're sort of like looking for ways of boiling it all down into sort of a spearhead, and then you're scared of omitting something, or maybe by omitting something you make for a bit of miscommunication. You know, so you leave out that one essential adjective, which could mean for someone to surmise the opposite of what it is. You know, so it was he was spot on. You know, so it was I was actually mismatched because the guy who was supposed to be in my slot was running late. So I literally, as soon as we arrived, I was march straight in there. And we had about 30 seconds of brief, and luckily I thrive on impromptu.
That's what I do here.
Yeah, it's groovy.
There's no list of questions or anything.
Great, yeah.
Book here to remind me.
Free form, yeah.
So it's Dave, so I'm just going to do a quick intro and then we'll get right into it.
Sure thing, yeah.
Well, it is an essential guide, as the title itself suggests, or rather the subtitle, Revisiting English Grammar. It's the work of two people, Johnny S. Geddes and Rosemary Finley. Finley, an instructor here at the University of Manitoba, and Johnny S. Geddes, who joins me in studio, a graduate, or rather a former student here at the University of Manitoba. Welcome.
Oh, thanks ever so much. Pleasure to be here.
So, I'm curious, because your background, journalism, and you're an author, and what led you to doing a guide to grammar? I mean, with Rosemary, it makes sense, right? Like, this is her bread and butter.
Of course. With me, I was geared towards journalism for quite some time, and then I got my master's degree in biography, of all things, in Buckingham University in England. And then after graduating, I wanted to turn that into resumes more than anything. So I started a company called The Text Vet in 2004, which was it began with composition enhancement and editing and proofreading. And I did a lot of resumes. I also did a lot of really, when I say essays, I don't mean the factual side, because that would be naughty, wouldn't it? I just did the hammering a lot of the phraseology together. So for the last, certainly in the 7 years up until when Rosemary caught me, I was doing resumes and then a lot of instruction guides. I was working under secondment to some companies.
So like as a technical writer?
As a technical writer, because I'm a trained technical writer as well. I mean, I had ISTC membership, which is a big thing in that guild. So it's and then Rosemary. What happened was Rosemary's I've known for quite some time. When I was here, I mean, she's a great friend. And basically, we were moving from England to Florida in 2011, and I heard from her at the end of 2011, and it was great to hear from her anyway. But then she said, would I be interested in coming on board this guide to English grammar that she had envisioned to work for St. Paul's College? As you know, she's at the German and Slavics Studies senior instructor. So I thought if anyone was going to know about grammar, and if anyone was going to sort of be a co-Sherpa on the ascent, she would be a great asset. So I said yes. I myself, having made writing my bread and butter and grammar, I found myself quite frequently correcting the grammar of especially younger people. I don't want to take it too ageistly, but I did notice that. Of course, I said yes. It was a thrill to come on board, definitely.
So you described it as co-Sherpa. I'm wondering if you can kind of elaborate on sort of the relationship between the two of you in terms of hammering out something like that.
Sure. I mean, I think in filmic terms, maybe co-Sherpa is perhaps taking it in the wrong direction, up the wrong mountain. But if in filmic terms, I think Rosemary would have been more the producer and I would have been the director. So I was certainly given free rein to devise and then bounce ideas off her. And what I suggested first, I mean, I'll go back to just briefly when I said yes. I remember this cold feeling came to my chest about an hour later after I fired off the email. And I realized that I was dealing with something quite big. It was like a Pandora's box. And I knew I was qualified underneath, but on the surface I thought, careful now, this is something really big. So I didn't renege on it. I was all gung-ho for it, but that feeling of coldness actually served me well, because it made me distance myself from myself and take the time to reanalyze how we were going to handle this. So Rosemary, I got back to her and I said, maybe we should have a sort of I don't mean a bellicose revolution, but we should have a sort of a revolutionary approach to it, rather than just doing another grammar book. So I decided to take it in an entirely different direction, rather than just sitting down and giving the students what I had been given way back in the 80s with my source material.
Right. So you mentioned a director and a producer. I mean, a director, oftentimes it's their vision, right? Like that's, you know, what we see on the screen.
Right.
You know, and the producer is kind of the person who either provides the money or, you know, makes things happen.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Is it that kind of thing, like where you're the one, like what you see in the pages?
I see. Yeah, but by and large, it was my. I would begin with a lot of the ideas, and then I would run them past Rosemary, and sometimes she would intercede and say, "Well, maybe we should do this instead," because my method was a two-layer approach, which I noticed that no one else had ever done before in a grammar book. I didn't really spend that much time on reconnaissance. I didn't want to sort of leaf through other books in case there was any osmosis. I wanted to tabula rasa it and assume the perspective of a student entering university. So let's sort of take it to a ground zero, and rather than get preconceived notions, I sort of emptied my mind. And I said to her, let's have a two-layer approach, which, and I went back to my technical author roots. I wanted to sort of treat grammar as if it were a machine, like this board or you know, like a fridge or even a bacon slicer, rather than go back to what I had been given in the 1970s and 80s. I think we had a book called The Art of English, which was the old starch-collared school marm, very severe method. I wonder if it even had any illustrations. And I saw that was completely, wholly, you know, there was no way to transpose that onto now, you know, youngsters nowadays especially. It just about worked for me because they caught me just in time. But I was the last of that sort of sub-generation that could have dealt with it back then, I think.
Right, and I mean the sequencing of a book like that, I'm thinking like Strunk and White or like, you know, a CP Style Guide or something. I mean, it's much more of like a resource, like a encyclopedia or dictionary or thesaurus, than, you know, let's walk you through progressively, which seems to be the idea behind this is, you know,
entirely.
You just got out of high school. Here's grammar as you need it as you progress.
Most assuredly, yeah. It was, I mean, I used the technical author approach, and really, in technical author school, there are 3 golden rules, and a lot of it is down to the visuals, and one of the rules is down to tone. So visually, you'll notice that there's a lot of space given over for calming zones like white space and illustrations. And that's one thing that I picked up in technical authoring school, and it really served me well, I think, in composing that. But then the second rule is to make sure that no 2 pages are alike, and that's for ease of navigability. And the third one, I think, is really the key to the enterprise, and that's the tone. I think because we're dealing with younger adults, we're sort of leading them through. Or it could be anyone from any age group. It could be mature students coming back after, you know, a time away in the real world. Maybe they need the rust dusted off from what they had remembered. But the idea was to take someone and presuppose that they had no foreknowledge. So just pretend that they're a novice, or they are novices. Tabula rasa, and lead your readership through. But the thing is, it's a very delicate balance to strike, not to alienate them by... what's the word? It's just slipped from me. To patronise them. that's the thing. To do that. So that was the balance I had to strike, and that was the first layer. The second layer, because that in itself would have been a very flat, dead enterprise if it had just been a technical manual. So I said to Rosemary, and Rosemary agreed, and she said that sounds like fun, and it sounded like the sort of thing that she had seen in, you know, maybe in other publications. But I said, why don't we have some sort of, you know, like in some language textbooks, it might give you a family, and then you follow them to the car showroom and then to a picnic, and you learn like the word for a wine bottle and all this sort of thing. And I thought, why not have comical situations happening in this fictitious town called Grammaropolis? And I'm also an author of horror and science fiction, so I thought, this could be a chance to sort of push the envelope out, or the boat out a bit. And one thing that I remembered from my schooling, now I know this is sort of grammar school, we called it over in the UK. But I can remember our history teachers, and then there was one fellow at the start of the year when we got the textbooks issued in September. He would sort of hand them out, and I went to an all-boys school for a while, and he used to say, all right lads, here you go, by the way, the woodcuts of the executions are on pages 34, 87, and, you know, we would sort of go through and go, ooh, look at that. So I was thinking, why not sort of take that sort of black comedy gallows humor and sort of maybe sort of weave jokes around it, and then use these jokes to elucidate the rules of grammar. So, of course, the risque nature of that would alienate what I would call the Sunday school picnic packers. But a lot of people of reasonable firmness would probably laugh and say, I can't believe he said that. But yeah, the rule would stick. Mm-hmm. And that's really what's running through it. And then, of course, we also have, at the other end of the scale, these wonderful little characters called the Langs. And there's 4 of them. And they're little cartoon icons. So you'll get Info Lang, and he'll appear to show you when a rule is coming up. And then you'll get Clara Lang, who appear to sort of clarify it and that sort of thing. So there's a lot happening visually, and I think it's almost like a sitcom effect.
So creating that second level,
mm-hmm.
right? Like you mentioned, that, like you've got your technical level,
sure,
and then this secondary level. Like, is that so that the ideas, like the stickiness of the ideas, like that things are retained better because it's sort of like an active thing rather than the passivity of just like, here's the information. Of
course, and Rosemary really agreed with this, because I said to her, why don't we have something that one can obviously pick up when one needs it, but also on a quiet Sunday afternoon, if nothing else is going on, maybe to sit down and, yes, to actually go from page 1 to 2 to 3, which I know it sounds utterly mad with a grammar book, but I thought, as we're going to have a revolutionary approach, so the first layer is going to be the technical, as if it were a guide to a computer program, or indeed a set of training procedures, which is what I've done as well as a technical writer. If that's the first layer, why don't we have something cozy, something admittedly halfway shocking in places, but something that gets people laughing and gets them to read on. So if they might want to expand on their grasps of how semicolons work, and so they find themselves going on to learn about colons and then ellipses, and they don't realise that they've moved on from what they initially wanted to research. It's because something led them on, and it was the entertainment value. Mm-hmm. That's it.
Did that also make it kind of more interesting for you then, in terms of, like,
indeed,
you're not just kind of doing rote technical, right? You're stretching your creative muscle.
Of course, without, at the risk of sounding vain, it was fun to write, because I thought by taking it was about perspectivism, and I thought, and Rosemary agreed, that we should strip it back to tabula rasa. And so you're assuming that there is no foreknowledge, because indeed nowadays I was somewhat aware from in England that there were some students who didn't know what grammar was in terms of what it did, but then there were some students who had never even heard of the word grammar, and I didn't know what the Canadian situation was. But I talked to Rosemary about this, and I said, let's take it fully back to tabula rasa. And what would you want to find in a grammar guide? So the entertainment value really came from there. So by having fun building it, we realised that it would be fun on the receiving end, as long as we made it fun enough.
Mm-hmm. When I turn to the forward, you kind of talk about grammar being, I mean, at first you contrast it with, like a mechanical device.
Sure.
But then you say, possibly more accurately, it's like the nervous system in a body. Right?
Indeed, yes.
I'm curious about A, like your sort of conception of that idea, but B, like it seems to be like by choosing sort of the organic versus the inorganic, you're allowing for the fact that grammar does change.
Yes, it's
like the body evolves. I mean,
indeed,
the brain that you're born with as a baby grows like
of course
a tremendous amount of size.
Indeed,
like 5 or 6 years old.
Sure.
Likewise, grammar is not the baby it once was.
No, but by the same token, grammar is pretty much a near indestructible entity, because I envisioned in what I said to Rosemary, the game, and really it's a game with 3 players. The whole dynamic, the whole economy of the way many people, the people I've spoken to have said grammar is dying, grammar is being assassinated, and I always have to sort of rebuke them and say grammar is actually indestructible. The thing that is suffering is our grasp upon it. So, for instance, the image of grammar is demonized. It's the snorting dragon at the back of the cave that has to be slain, or people don't want to go near it. And the people who speak up for grammar are called grammar Nazis or what have you. And even think books like The Art of English, which I was given, are by association with the old image of grammar, are sort of viewed as Okay, well, back they go in the cabin with the dragon then, if they're going to support it. But it's funny you should mention the organic-inorganic approach, because I think in this game there are three players, as I said. So there's grammar, which still manages to open up and embrace modernity by sort of, it'll open the dictionaries once in a while. So we have to friend, to unfriend, to Google. And it's at least affords something, it gives something over time. Otherwise it's quite inflexible. The second player is people, so you, I, and everyone else. And we haven't changed innately over millennia. I mean, in terms of our reactions to what we know as being good things, bad things. It's really our social systems and our societal development that has moved on, or some people say has regressed. So people is the second player. That's right, it's a singular. Yes, it is. And then the third thing is modernity. And many people confuse modernity with the youngsters who are massacring it. Modernity is really where grammar is at or rather our grasp of grammar is having a crisis. Because I always defend the young people. I say it's not them. They're in the crosshairs of advertisers and corporate speak. Because the corporate culture is really, they're themselves at the mercy of the psychologists who say, well, if you're behind a bus and you see this banner, you've got 0.5 seconds to acknowledge the message. So that panics the corporation. They go, well, we better get a spearhead or a kernel of information and throw grammar out the window. So I think grammar, whilst it's being organic, it's pretty much like one of the ancient Greek titans, where it's got a level of invulnerability. You're right, it has grown in the days since Chaucer. But I think in the 19th century, when most of the final screws were tightened into place, and then in the early 20th century, I think it's becoming more and more inflexible, but at least it's willing to change ever so slightly.
Well, I mean, we live in this, this book was written in the sort of the post-Eat, Shoots, and Leaves era, right? Like,
Indeed, yeah.
Lynn Truss kind of brought, it made it a cause célèbre.
Indeed, yeah.
The proper use of apostrophes. And
of course, yeah.
And comma and things like this.
Mm-hmm.
But the society we live in, the modernity that you were talking about,
right?
It's not just necessarily advertisers or things like that. Our communication has changed, right? Like, I mean, like a text, right, or a tweet on Twitter.
Indeed, yeah.
There's a limitation placed on it in terms of how much you can.
Exactly.
Right? And so,
yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And this is the thing. Like I had a professor here who'd written a book, and she talked about as long as you're still understood.
Yeah,
right, like
yeah.
that the other person gets the message, how the message is conveyed is less important than the message being delivered. And I'm curious about your response to that as someone who's written a book that's pretty much, let's walk you through how to send a proper message.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I appreciate the sentiment, and in terms of, I mean, I would say if your life absolutely depended upon it, by all means fire out something ungrammatical if it's life or death. But at the risk of sounding like an ostrich or boorish or something, I mean that approach is anathema to what I would suggest is going on in there, because the problem is, I mean, we recognise and we want people to realise that we're not against vernacular. We understand that there is casual speech, but the trick is to know when you're using it, and it's almost as if there's a switch on the back of your head or on your back. So if you're writing in an exam or writing an essay or in a formal situation, you just reach around and flick it. And I think a lot of people have never been told that there is a switch behind them. And I think with the compression of message, it's really sort of making for these allowable deviations. So then how far can they take it before it goes to, are you ready to go somewhere? And then the day may come when we might degenerate. I mean, I might be using this as an extreme example. You've seen Quest for Fire. I can see, I hope we're nowhere near that, but 2 centuries, 3 centuries away, perhaps, on the trajectory that we're on, I can almost see us slipping back into this sort of, we have the shell people, the sand people going zog, zog, grunt, grunt, because the dialects will have really got in the way of the binding force that lubricates the language, that is grammar in universal English or Canadian English.
You talk about having this switch that because obviously context can obviously dictate how specific you can be or sort of pedantic you are about grammar. That writing an essay, it's a formal setting, right?
Of course,
in the same way that submitting a resume or something, right? Like there's,
Indeed,
a
yeah.
stylistic way or like a certain expectation as a society. But if you're firing off an email or a text to a friend,
Oh, no,
that's,
yeah.
you turn that switch off.
Sure,
right?
indeed, yeah, indeed.
There are some people, like there's like the grammar Nazis, who
Yeah.
would argue that switch should always be on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even in the context of an email, which is informal, you should still use specifically the proper grammar.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and I'm curious. It sounds like you kind of sing
I'm
on the choir of angels that that's not necessarily the case, right? That
yeah,
you should
I'm
know the context.
indeed. I'm sort of in the middle. I would veer towards the grammar enforcers. I'm just going to call them guardedly, but because the idea is by sheer weight of repetition. It's. I mean, I know what I'm doing. I know if I'm saying something, like say if I've locked my keys inside my car and I have to text, I'm going to sort of, if I need it now, I need it urgently, I will feel bad, or badly, hang on, which one's real, but I will certainly fire off the message to my wife to, "Look, please come and let me into my car." But the idea is that I know that I'm doing it. It's almost as if I'm saying sorry and looking up into the great cosmos, but I think the problem is if one if one doesn't encourage others or doesn't mention that, yeah, I know I'm being casual. Especially with youngsters, not so much 18-year-olds, but certainly in a household with children growing up, if they sort of see mum and dad doing this, and then they take it to school with them, and especially in the school context, I think that's the framework that is now, where I think creativity is put ahead of grammatical correctness. The risk is run of nurturing this sort of thing where the child becomes an adult and suddenly realizes, or doesn't realize rather, that there's no grasp of grammar whatsoever, because at least we know when to switch on and off. But what if either the switch is broken or the pupil who becomes the student reaches round and finds that the switch won't even turn because they can't remember what the other setting is like. That sort of thing, yeah.
Speaking of creativity, in terms of being put ahead of grammar, so not necessarily the case with you, but you've written Gothic horror and you mentioned you also write science fiction.
Sure.
And I'm curious because I think Gothic horror, the expectation is, there is grammar.
Of course.
Grammar matters within the context of something.
Corsets
Gothic,
and all that
right?
sort of thing. Yeah, yeah,
It's steeped in a very long tradition.
Of course.
A
Indeed.
stylistic approach.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas science fiction,
Yes.
has pushed at the outer limits
Indeed.
of what's acceptable, right? I mean, you think of someone like Philip K. Dick,
Of course, yeah.
Burroughs. I mean, or more recently, like Neil Stephenson,
Sure.
and like bringing in like textual writing, right? Like that, writing in computer code or messing with language, messing with grammatical structure.
And indeed, why not? Yeah, yeah.
If you write science fiction, are you the type that pushes at those limits, or do you try to hew within sort of the existing structures?
Interesting question. I mean, I was once asked this question in relation to evil doings in my horror aspects, or my short stories, for instance, and I always say I can't be held responsible for what my characters do. It's not like medieval morality plays, where they have to be shepherded towards exposition, so you've got Mephistopheles has to be evil, and then the good pilgrim has to do this. I think with science fiction, it's the whole logos of science fiction is, unlike horror, which is to make the reader cozy by shock. With science fiction, it is about pushing the envelope and actually getting out there. So I think it's okay to certainly adopt these things. I mean, certainly in explicating an alien world, or to depict it, it's fine, or to show a dystopian or utopian future. If indeed, and I probably will be turning in my grave or urn at this point, in 2215, then if language has degenerated to that point, it would be frightening. And I'm glad that science fiction writers are at least reaching out, maybe not so much for that, but at least to show where we might go. Hopefully somewhere better than that dystopic view. But yeah, I see nothing wrong with it, because that's the remit of a science fiction writer, to explore. It's fine. It's different from proselytizing, where they at the end they have this sort of codicil where now that you've read the book, go out and speak like the characters. It's it's not like that at all.
Right. Do you find when you write science fiction that like that sort of release of the strictures,
Mm-hmm.
is it a freeing thing, or is it kind of maybe does it make you feel reticent, like, or reluctant to kind of step into the breach?
I think it's like going to the gym with the punching bag in some regards, because I think a lot of it, I've never been frustrated with grammar myself, but I think, I mean, I've stopped correcting people completely now, because it's like digging a hole in dry sand. Most of the grains will rush back in anyway, and then you get the situation where you can get people becoming very upset with you. So I sometimes like to deliberately, in my short stories, have people who, for a purpose, will speak in a certain way. I mean, dialects and vernacular they are wonderful to use, especially in Britain. I don't know if you're familiar with a lot of the
yeah, I mean, like Cockney
or Cornish is another great one. You know,
yeah,
it's
I mean, we have the same sort of equivalent in terms of like Newfoundland speak. And,
of course. And it's fun to sort of paint the realism. And I'll never forget being in Cornwall, and this funny old man. I was visiting a friend, and my wife and I were in the gym, and this old man came up to me afterwards, because I just got off the treadmill, and I hadn't been exerting myself to the point of sweating. But he comes up and he hands me a towel, and he goes, "I'd wipe that down if I were you. Mate, I'm very sorry your eyes." And I looked at him. I wanted to go because he was so OTT. But that was his nature, and I thought, right, dude, you're so going in my next short story, because, and I'm sure even in I mean, of course, there's a grammar in every because it is a proper language, but even sort of in science fiction, where you have planets with their own or world living, like Tolkien with his own sort of with the elves, the dwarves, and all their sort of writing in hieroglyphs, I think it was, or Ogham or something like that. So it's fun to world build, but ultimately when you walk away from the keyboard and you sort of make your cup of coffee and the phone goes and you're talking to your agent or something, or it's all about knowing a time and a place, I think.
Right. This is all about teaching you a time.
Oh, of course. Yeah, indeed.
The book is Revisiting English Grammar, an Essential Guide. Co-written with Rosemary Finley. Johnny, thanks very much for taking some time to sit down and talk about it.
Well, it's been a pleasure being here. Thanks ever so much for having me. Cheers, Michael. Yeah.